I think we can start, huh? I was just wondering. So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our workshop on confronting strategic corruption and illicit finance. I've just realized that today is the longest day of the year, which is perfect for our workshop. We can go on probably even after our time. My name is Desislava Gockova. I'm the head of the Regional Anti-Corruption Initiative Secretariat based in Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and it is my honor to be the moderator of the discussion today. This workshop is a follow-up to the Summit of Democracy Cohort on anti-corruption policies and national security, which has been coordinated by the Center for Study of Democracy, Ministry of Justice of Bulgaria, and supported by the Regional Anti-Corruption Initiative and Saudi Network. In the recent years, corruption has evolved in both a strategic threat to national security, economic and social development, and democracy itself, and into a systemic gap, policy gap, where private interests significantly influence the state decision-making processes to the advantage of the public interest, and very often at the expense of the public goods. Today we are joined by a distinguished group of experts who have dedicated their careers to uncovering, analyzing, and fighting against this very complex issue. They bring a wealth of knowledge and experience from diverse fields, from law, political science, and also civil society advocacy. I think we have a back noise. A competition with stronger voice. Together we will delve into the mechanics of strategic corruption, explore its impact on societies, and discuss effective strategies for preventing and addressing it. I would like to thank you all for being here. I know it's been a very long day. And without further ado, let us embark into our dialogue, starting with our keynote speaker, Mr. Christian Beck. Mr. Beck has been heading Daniel Frohn's MEP office, working mainly in the Constitutional Affairs Committee, with a focus on lobbying, transparency and integrity of the EU institutions, the future of the EU and the rule of law, since 2019. And today, Mr. Beck will present the EU perspective in fortifying democracy by combating corruption, governance backsliding, and he will present the most recent developments in the EU with regards to anti-money laundering. Mr. Beck, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm even more boring than presented. I do that already since 10 years, not only since 5, before for another Green member of the European Parliament. So it's already a long-standing hobby. And it has probably grown even more important because in times of war, it's an extreme danger that our European democracy is so vulnerable and can be so easily bought, like in some regards, and a lot of examples show that it is at the moment. Basically, if Putin could design how the EU should function, he would probably have a system like we have it, that you can have vetoes, national vetoes in decisions in the Council, and if you turn one government around, and oftentimes the government of Viktor Orban in Hungary turns around, he has excessively used his national veto on many, many decisions, on sanctions on Russia, on a lot of other issues too, oftentimes to extort EU funds for himself that he then used to buy loyalty in his own country and subvert the rule of law and democracy, and that is really dangerous. There is a lot of outside money flowing into the EU. We have seen it also in this election campaign very much, that Kremlin money, that Chinese money is flowing into the EU. We have seen it already long years before, that basically the extreme right of Europe receives significant funding from Russia. If it is Le Pen who got a credit, or if it is Salvini who stood with his fan T-shirt on the Kremlin, on the square in front of the Kremlin, or also the extreme right in Germany, Alternative für Deutschland, and others. So we have seen this. We have seen that they not only use this money directly, we have seen that they use Gazprom, oligarchs to cover this money, to make it not officially state influence, but to make it something that can pose as non-state and is therefore slightly more tricky to catch. The danger is that you don't need to buy all 720 MEPs to change the EU policies. You just need to buy a few in the middle. And whatever has happened now with the right-wing turn, supported with all this money, is definitely helping Putin. And it has moved 40 people from the one to the other side in the European Parliament. And that is definitely a significant change that makes it more easy for Putin, for the Chinese government, to get their way, to get less of resistance from a unified Europe. The Qatargate scandal has illustrated that again and shaken up a lot of people in our European Parliament. It has helped to bring about reforms, and we have achieved some. But it's still the case that basically, if Akaili received thousands of euros per month from a oil-rich country in the Gulf region, and she didn't declare it. We had also Radoslav Sikorski, member of the European Parliament, and he received thousands of euros per month from an oil-rich country in the Gulf region and declared towards the European Parliament, MEPs need to declare their side income, and he declared that he received money from Sikorsky Global, a company of himself. So he didn't need to declare in the current rules who his clients were, that it was the United Arab Emirates. You could see that in the declaration towards the Sejm, the Polish parliament, but not in the European Parliament, because our rules are weaker, and we voted on that after Qatargate, and we had a majority to make that a little tougher, but we didn't have the majority of the members that we would have needed. So we didn't get it. So another to-do for this term. That leaves us still very vulnerable, because you can receive outside money. You don't even have to declare from whom outside you get it. I would try to use the rest of my time for giving an overview of legal instruments we have been working on and how far we are on them, to give you a rough overview and leave more details to the rest. So the most powerful instrument has been definitely the conditionality mechanism, to be able to freeze money for EU governments that violate structurally democracy and rule of law. We have pushed, despite little clear competences on the Parliament side, we have pushed the Commission into action with suing them, with a lot of cross-party resolutions and so on. And still half of the money is frozen for Viktor Orban. And it will be a fight through the now starting Hungarian presidency to keep it this way until he really reforms the country and not only fakes this, as he has tried before. We had frozen the money for the Polish government, and the Polish people have voted for a new pro-democracy government instead of the old one whose funds were frozen. So if you do that, it has an effect. It surely didn't depend only on that, but I think it supported the civil society, courageous people that have fought for this change too. In Hungary, it was not the case before their elections, and Viktor Orban got re-elected. So at least there is a correlation. You make out of it as a causation. We have lobby registers. It was one of the earliest successes. We have that in the EU since a while. It's not mandatory because we don't have the power of the law so easily, because it's not in the treaties that allow us to have a clear law on that. So we work with incentives. We have in some member states binding lobby registers that give you an overview where does money flow into the political space. But in many member states we don't have anything of that. What the Commission originally said is entirely impossible, to have a binding register by European law they now made a proposal short before the elections. Defense of democracy is the name of the package. And it could be a defense of our democracy, but it's an uphill battle because in the council it seems that there's less appetite for that. We have fought for the publication of lobby meetings, but still some are missing. We have a ban on lobby jobs, but you can still, as I said, receive money from lobbies. There is still something to be done. We have introduced asset declarations for MEPs, against a lot of resistance, especially from my home country, Germany, while in other countries that's totally normal. But that is, of course, crucial to have also oversight of that. I understand some here in the round have made great comparisons that will help us probably to fight for that further. We have the need of independent control of those rules because you all are the independent control, of course, as well when you go vote in European elections, as far as you can do that. And but it needs more independent control than that. We introduced now an EU ethics body to be the starting point for that, but it was less strong as we hoped for. So will be a review battle in this term. We have the justice institutions. The colleagues from EPO have already talked on the plenary stage, but we don't have the judicial court on EU level which would lead such investigations. That could be a project too, for something where we need to strengthen our institutions. And media freedom is an essential area because we have now a Media Freedom Act which gives us some more transparency on the way before you get extreme media concentration, because that's always a crucial tool if you want to take over a country or if you want to lessen our voices in the public domain. And the problem is that this law doesn't allow to break concentration that already exists. So Hungary's foundation that has basically amassed all the media, the KESMA, cannot be broken up by this law, and neither can be the Berlusconi empire in Italy that will be inherited and doesn't dissolve just because Silvio Berlusconi has died. So there's a lot to be done. All of these fights usually depend on a very awake public, because now even more difficult than in the last term to push those last MEPs to go for this majority, to get the 4 people we had for mandatory lobby publication, the 8 people we had for the independent control of the ethics body. To push those people, we need your support. That's why I asked colleagues to hand around one list where you can, if you like to, give us your email and receive an update if something important happens. I promise we're busy enough not to be having the time to spam you. So that would help us for alerting you when the crucial moments come, and then hopefully have a little bit more those people in the parliament feel that at home they are watched. Because in the end of the day, Brussels is too often far away, and only when people feel their home constituency watches them, we can achieve something in Brussels. So it needs to be a team action. That's why I hope for your support. And your questions, if there are any.
Thank you very much. I mean, this was very insightful, and it provided us with a very good starting point for our further discussions. And I really hope that you will also engage in our discussion, providing with your inputs and ideas. Before we start with the actual discussion, let me very briefly introduce all our esteemed panelists. And I'm going to stick a little bit to my notes in order not to forget to mention something which is very important from their really impressive bios. So, right next to me is Dr. Oksana Hus, who is a policy analyst in the Anti-Corruption and Integrity in Government Division Directorate for Public Governance at the OECD. Before joining OECD, Oksana worked as a researcher in Germany, Netherlands, and Italy, analyzing anti-corruption technology, social movements, and open government. As an independent consultant, she provided policy advice to the Council of Europe, EU, UNODC, and multiple country programs. She is a co-founder of the Interdisciplinary Corruption Research Network, and she is also an author of the book How Corruption and Anti-Corruption Policies Sustain Hybrid Regimes. I guess she's going to share some of her outcomes and recommendations from this book today as well. Next to her is Professor Elizabeth David Barrett, Professor of Governance and Integrity and Director of the Center for the Study of Corruption at the University of Sussex. She has over 15 years of experience in researching corruption and anti-corruption policies. Her work primarily focuses on corruption risks in public procurement and the interference between government and business. David Barrett has advised the UK Department for International Development and the UK Cabinet on anti-corruption strategies and has collaborated with regulators and civil society in countries such as Jamaica, Ghana, Uganda, and Tanzania. Well, I think this is also very important to highlight that she has authored several influential reports for Transparency International and led policy discussions at the G20 and other international forums. She previously held posts at the University of Oxford and worked with the London think tanks and reported as a journalist in Eastern Europe for prominent outlets such as The Economist and BBC World Service before returning to the academia. So very extensive and very broad experience. Mr. David Jackson is a political scientist with extensive experience in the Western Balkans. His PhD dissertation focused on the interaction between pattern-client networks and state-building efforts in Kosovo municipalities. Mr. Jackson has served as an analyst and consultant for various international organizations and NGOs, including the World Health Organization, Transparency International, and Helvetia Swiss Intercorporation. He also has held positions at the Cabinet Office in London with the development and also with development NGOs in Jordan. Dr. Nadim Hodzic is a research fellow at the University of Oslo's Faculty of Law with expertise in corruption, rule of law, EU law, international law, negotiations, peace building, and Western Balkans politics. His scholarship focuses on how judiciaries tackle corruption, examining anti-corruption campaigns in Italy, Brazil, and Romania, and exploring the intersection of security and corruption. So he has worked extensively on the legal and political dynamics between European Union and the Western Balkans and contributed to the constitutional amendments and reform proposals in Bosnia and Herzegovina. He has also collaborated with various international organizations like USAID, OECD, and is also a member of the International Republican Institute's Task Force on Western Balkans. Dr. Ramadan Ilazi, our next speaker, currently serves as the head of research at the Kosovo Center for Security Studies. He holds a doctorate in politics and international relations from Dublin City University in Ireland and a master's degree in peace and conflict studies from St. Andrews University in Scotland. Previously, he held the position of Kosovo Deputy Minister for European Integration, where he was involved in supporting the process of preparing the national plan for the implementation of the Stabilization and Association Agreement with the European Union and developing the European Reform Agenda for Kosovo. He's also an author of various books. His last book is on the European Union and everyday state building, the case of Kosovo. He's going to today also present the case study of Kosovo. And last but not the least, my colleague from the Center for Study of Democracy, Daniela Mineva. She is a senior analyst and economic and program manager, and with more than 21 years of experience with EU and other donor-financed projects on the topic of anti-corruption, EU integration, and cohesion funds. She is also involved in the initiative Civil Society for Good Governance and Anti-Corruption in Southeast Europe, and she has been coordinating the regional good governance public-private partnership platform since 2023. So as you could see, we have a various expertise today at the stage. And I would suggest that we now delve into the discussion with my first question, which is going to be to Mrs. Oksana Hughes. Oksana, I would say let's first decide what is strategic corruption. You have been thoroughly examining this phenomenon, so would you please explain how strategic corruption works and what is the difference between strategic corruption and the so-called regular corruption?
Yes, that's an easy question for Thursday evening. At the OECD, we published in March the very first anti-corruption and integrity outlook that sets some priorities that OECD considers important for the next time to look into when designing anti-corruption policies. And one of three important strands that we see is the foreign interference. So considering foreign interference when designing anti-corruption and integrity frameworks. And strategic corruption, this is one of the main tools for the foreign interference. So we define strategic corruption as weaponization of the loopholes in the integrity frameworks of the host country by the perpetrator country, misused for geostrategic goals. Two things to highlight here. So what is the difference to a normal corruption, or otherwise how we thought about corruption in the previous years? That we are shifting our focus towards security. The corruption is not only economic problem or welfare problem that is nice to have when we are dealing with, but this is a security issue that can undermine institutions and the sovereignty of the state. Second point in this definition is the reference to the loopholes of the country in the integrity system. And here is important to highlight that it's not only a problem of a perpetrator country. This definition brings the responsibility of each country to deal with the loopholes in the integrity framework. So in Ukraine, I will refer to this country because I'm privileged to coordinate anti-corruption and integrity review in Ukraine, so I know quite good this system. In Ukraine, before the full-scale Russian invasion, corruption has been used exactly for these purposes to undermine the statehood. In a political sphere, there were many examples of political parties undermining elections through people who are associated with the Putin's family, having godfather relationships, having then parties in the Ukrainian parliament, and passing the laws that are in favor of Russian geostrategic politics. There were also cases in the economy, you know very well, gas schemes that increase dependence of Ukraine on Russia, or also undermining the whole aluminium industry through the oligarchic business from Russia in Ukraine that has been using lobbying system or actually not rightful lobbying for advancing. Or also in the judiciary, in 2020, Ukraine has undergone a constitutional crisis that has been triggered by judges that have relationships and assets in Russia. So all this shows that corruption can be a tool of a hybrid warfare. One more point to highlight, that it's not doing just to the concept if we think of strategic corruption only as a foreign bribery of some politician or some individuals. This is much more. And just to hit you with a very theoretical scheme on Thursday evening, and to put my academic hat on, together with Joseph Pochka Alvarez, we've been working on a literature review of many sources that refer to strategic corruption in a policy literature, in academic literature. Joseph digged even in some sources since end of 19th century to figure out how it worked back then. So we defined or modeled the system of strategic corruption, and just to simplify it to 3 elements, what we have there. One is this collusion between private and public sphere, like what we have as a state capture or other way around the business capture. We have also international element with the illicit financial flows and corrosive capital. And we have in the domestic country as the goal undermining institutions. So this is not only, again, having a profit, corruption for profit of individuals, also this is, of course, an important aspect of it, but this is much more to go into institutional system and to undermine it. I think I will stop here.
Great. I mean, I really like the chart. I mean, it explains very well what strategic corruption is. And I think actually combining and illustrating with a case study from Ukraine and then with academia is very useful. And at least for me, I would like now to ask Liz, we have heard from Oksana how strategic corruption works, but would you please tell us more about what is state capture and how is it linked to strategic corruption? Is it linked and how?
So thanks very much, Desi. So just to follow on from this great introduction to strategic corruption, so another concept that we're looking at is state capture. This is a concept that we started using to describe corruption really in the late 90s, early 2000s, and the idea was that it seemed to describe this quite high-level patterns of corruption that we saw, particularly in the privatization process in some parts of Eastern Europe, in Russia, for example, so with a lot of assets easily being given out to oligarchs. So at the time, state capture was distinguished from administrative corruption, and the distinction was that whereas administrative corruption is your kind of petty corruption, it tends to be one-off transactions, the rules and the system are there, and you basically bribe someone to get around them in that instance. That's distinguished from state capture, which happens much earlier in the kind of public policy process. So state capture was about improperly influencing the laws, the policy as they were set, the rules of the game. State capture was then going to have much longer term and more damaging consequences because what happens is you bake in the advantage that narrow interest group gets from having shaped and influenced the rules of the game. So the whole economy and the market from that point on is skewed in their favor. And so we see that has a kind of cumulative effect. So that's what we were talking about late 90s, early 2000s. The concept has evolved partly because the practices we've seen have evolved, and practices that we've seen in Europe but also in other places around the world. Hungary under Orban is a classic example. So here we've got actually the captor group is not necessarily these business interests outside. It's actually people who are in politics, so Fidesz, people around Orban, and they're engaging in state capture. Now, this looks a bit different because if you're in the politics, you've got access to different kinds of power, some of that which you've got completely legitimately, you've been democratically elected. But you can then use the kinds of power that you have in ways that are illegitimate. And so what we see with this kind of politics-led state capture is that, in fact, it moves into 3 spheres. So it's that original thing of trying to control and shape the rules of the game. We see it not just with influencing the legislative process, but also with constitutional changes and changes to the judiciary. You also see a very systematic capture of the implementation sphere. So this is doing things like using your power of patronage to appoint your cronies and allies into those key positions, which are, for example, giving out grants, giving out public procurement contracts, etc. So you can control the implementation process. And then what we also see is capture of institutions that are supposed to be holding the executive power to account. So a kind of disabling of the media, civil society, the judiciary, some of those institutions like state audit institutions that should be a check on executive power. This kind of capture we've seen in Hungary, but we also see it in Turkey under Erdogan. We saw it, I think, to some extent in Poland under Law and Justice. Going further afield, I think we saw this in Bolsonaro's Brazil, in Modi's India. There are lots of examples of this kind of thing. It's still a relationship between politics and business, but I think it's driven more by people on the political side. And of course, it becomes difficult to disentangle politics and business. What's the link with strategic corruption? Well, I think there are a few links. One is that if you've got a captured state, then that is much more vulnerable to strategic corruption. So essentially, you've got a very centralized state and a very centralized polity. So if you've got this outside influence coming in, then it's easier then to get access to a lot of control because you've already got a captured state. But at the same time, you might also find that this strategic corruption facilitates the capturing of the state, provides funds often, and political cover in various kinds of ways. In terms of the funds, this is often through sovereign investment. That might be from state-owned enterprises or from sovereign wealth funds. Okay. And that investment is often, to pick up on something that Oksana mentioned, corrosive capital, a term which refers to capital which is coming in, but it's coming in a way that is not market-oriented. It's not necessarily about trying to make a profit. It's about trying to get the strategic political influence. It's non-transparent often, so you can't really see what the deal involves and what the conditions might be. And it's also often outside the usual legal framework. So, for example, it doesn't go through public procurement laws. It goes in a kind of government-to-government deal, which we have very little oversight of. We see this from a number of countries. Russia and China, of course, we see it a lot. There's a piece in the FT today about Russia's influence over the nuclear power sector. We've seen that in Hungary, of course. In the FT piece, they're talking about Bangladesh. We've seen with China, of course, the One Belt, One Road initiative, which again has brought this political influence, partly through lending and financing, but also through building in these long-term strategic partnerships around infrastructure. I'll stop there, but that's just a sort of overview of the landscape and the links.
Thank you very much. I think you both managed to really explain in details about the concepts. But being a practitioner, for me it's always important how we translate the concepts into practical actions, which brings me to my next question to David. How useful is the concept of strategic corruption in enhancing anti-corruption efforts, and are there any specifics? For example, you have been working in the Western Balkans, and me being based in the Western Balkans, I'm a little bit probably more interested in this. But is there any difference, or I mean, it's global phenomenon which has to be tackled the same way?
Yeah, thank you, Desi. And by the way, I'm here representing the U4 Anti-Corruption Resource Centre, just to clarify that. A great question. So I'm new to this concept, strategic corruption. I actually haven't been working on it too much. So I've been thinking, is it useful? In 2 years' time, will we be here at the next IACC talking about strategic corruption even? Do we need to start making these T-shirts, FUCK, strategic corruption, the little hats? Is it going to be a big thing? Is it going to be helpful for anti-corruption strategies beyond the EU, beyond the near neighborhood, in Georgia, Fiji, etc.? So I was thinking about this, and I think it's really important that we come up with new concepts that can give sight to blind spots here. This really sheds light on how external influences can play into domestic corruption. But also, I think most importantly, it really emphasizes the systemic nature of corruption. So corruption is not an amalgamation of practices or occurrences. Corruption is part of broader logics. And I think strategic corruption emphasizes that corruption is caught up in these geopolitics of other states, of third states wanting to influence other states. But how far can this concept travel? is it going to be useful for domestic strategies? And I think we should question this, because it's not a concept which has been dropped by the anti-corruption gods. It comes from a particular securitization agenda where there's particular concerns. That's not a problem in and of itself, but again, is it useful beyond that agenda? And not everyone thinks like us. So will this concept, strategic corruption, resonate in a lot of different countries? So I was talking to your colleague Daniela Ruslan in Bulgaria. He said that, well, there's a lot of people, perhaps a majority, who may be sympathetic towards Russia. So casting Russian activities as strategic corruption perhaps won't resonate at all. So that's not the basis of a good strategy. But I think it can be. I think if it's used in a balanced way, rather than a pivot to strategic corruption, we can talk about it as a complementary agenda. Again, we shouldn't use it as a way to exempt domestic elites from all the local corruption and networks there. And I think also we should maybe think about the political economy of strategic corruption. So no strategic corruption is likely to be the same. And we should avoid a kind of generic agenda. It's not a technical issue. I would maybe disagree with the OECD definition around loopholes. I think it's more of a political conundrum, especially in states where there's systemic forms of corruption. So in terms of thinking about, well, what do we need to understand around the political economy of strategic corruption? So I thought about three things. Liz has mentioned one already. But first, I think if we're thinking about strategies in these states, well, what is the positionality of local elites in relation to the external corruptor? This would determine what kind of strategies are likely to be feasible. If they're in opposition, as maybe the case is in Moldova, then these sweeping reforms may be possible, feasible. If it's a bit more ambiguous, maybe in Bosnia or other places, then maybe civil society emphasizing bottom-up accountability would be more useful. Second, what is the embeddedness of corruption in these states versus rule of law? As Liz said, to what extent are does state capture operate? Is there a free market for corruption in these states? If so, these kind of legalistic reforms may not bite. Maybe you need conditionality, as Christian mentioned. If there is a basic rule of law, then these targeted approaches, strengthening conflict of interest, asset declarations, then I think they can work. And then I think we have to think through, well, what is the strategic corruption aiming towards? What is the agenda here? There are different kinds of strategic corruption agendas. It could be about economic influence, informational influence, security influence. And I think thinking through the different types can lead to questions about, okay, what kind of indirect strategies, so not using typical anti-corruption tools, would we need in these situations? So if it really is about economic influence, do we need then a better economic plan in these countries, better forms of economic development? So I'll leave it there.
Yes, very, very interesting. And I would like to go back to Oksana and ask her, what are the main implications of strategic corruption for the anti-corruption policies then?
Yes, I actually like the ideas that David raised in this challenging way. Do we really need this concept? And the implications that we have now for the policies, they go back rather to a new framing of corruption and maybe new understanding around corruption than comparing what we have had in the last few years. Because in the past we were focused on these economic implications. And with the understanding that this is a security issue, even high-income countries, they cannot say like, but we have corruption as a minor problem. or our integrity loopholes, they are so. We should look into developing countries. They have a lot of corruption. So this is basically what we had in the last 30 years in the thinking, in the language, and this is changing, and this is one of the implications that high-income countries, they should also look into their integrity frameworks. The second one is, how do we go about corruption risk assessments? Because those very technical tools in anti-corruption policies, they are usually based on the idea that we calculate how much corruption costs and how frequent it comes. But if we think of a strategic corruption, then we should anticipate, so look forward when we think about the risks. Which risks can corruption bring, and especially to the institutions? So what does it mean when the parliament is captured? Can we calculate it economically? Can we calculate the cost? Is there occurrence that we can see and then set the priorities? No, this is a different logic, how we approach corruption risk assessment. What does it mean for anti-corruption system as well? I appreciate, David, that you mentioned this securitization, because first, very intuitive thought is, okay, we need to securitize anti-corruption, so perhaps secret services deal with the issue. That would be a huge disaster in this case, exactly, because actually what we need, much more coordination intra-governmentally, so between different departments, which is really difficult to establish when we have like someone who is dealing with internal affairs and external affairs, and there is no one in between to bring those together. So you need to create stuff, you need to create regulations that do all this work. So these very technical issues, but they are also implication when we think about anti-corruption in a new way. And the last point, that we need much more intergovernmental work to identify, to target international illicit money flows, but also increase capacities to work together and to also define sanctions. I will stop here.
Yeah, very good. I mean, I think that's also, first of all, we have to have an understanding of the problem and then design strategies to address it. And you have been mentioning illicit finances, and I would like to go back to Mr. Beck and ask him about the EU new anti-money laundering legislation and how and whether it would address corruption and potentially strategic corruption.
Happily, because I really didn't address that question much at the beginning. So I think that there was some relevant progress made on anti-money laundering in the legislation that was decided really in the last month before the European elections. Basically in January, February, I think there came big deals made between the lawmaking institutions, Council and Parliament. We have seen that now where we had a directive before, so now I'm very nerdy, where we had a directive before, which means that every member state must translate EU law into national law, and then usually a lot of translation issues appear, and it's all much weaker where we would like it to be the strongest. And this we don't have now anymore because we made it a regulation. So it directly applies to every member state the same. That, of course, doesn't mean that it's still worth making a lot of comparisons if the effective practice, if the translation of law into practice by the administration really is the same and is strong enough. So there's still a lot to be done. Then we have now, for the first time, a direct control on anti-money laundering rules by an EU institution that will be newly created in Frankfurt, which I think is the worst of all places, because Germany has been a money laundering haven for like mafias from Italy, but other places too. It was always easy to carry your cash into a German notary and then say, I would like to buy this house here, and don't ask where this money comes from. So that is now forbidden because we have a ban on cash payments above 10,000. Many other countries had that already. Germany now finally gets it through the European law too, which I think is really useful. We have always demanded as Greens, I think a lot of organizations probably here around on the stage as well, probably a lot of you in the audience too, that there should be registers of assets as precise as possible so you can track the money. I think that's a key tool. Also in Qatargate, it was anti-money laundering rules that initiated the procedures. So it's very important. We don't have the full asset registers that we wanted, but we have that if there's trade in high value assets, yachts, expensive cars, that sort of stuff, if that is traded, then financial intelligence units, the brains of anti-corruption in each country, need to be automatically notified. They can store those notifications and they can exchange them among each other. So it's sort of a register, but we agreed with the council we don't call it like this, so they keep their red line. It will be probably an issue of like how to access those data, but it will probably helpful. Right. Another issue is, of course, real estate registers. There, again, we don't have what we originally wanted. We have that you can... that you have a single access point per country. So we as you as campaigners, as NGOs, you have one single access point to ask your questions. They should be able to answer all questions with all available information. They didn't go the way to say, well, and this should be European connected. So we still don't have the one point where you can look for all of the EU. So like we had on Andrzej Babiš and his empire, you could see what he had only in the registers of other countries that were more precise on allowing to see the real beneficiary at the end of the chain. So we might still have to deal with these issues, and we might still have to have the clever studies that you compile and then influence our policy making with, where you find these connections. But at least we got closer to what we needed to, and now we'll need to see if these new laws really have a relevant impact on our lawmaking. If I shortly may, few answers to the colleagues. Basically, I found the point on strategic corruption and what David mentioned. Is it a clever concept? I think in the climate of the European institutions have moved to the right. It is helpful to have a security-based discourse over it, because this has shown already in the last parliament. We had a committee that looked particularly into strategic corruption as a danger, and you had the Liberal and the Christian Democrat agree that there is an issue with that, because it was security talk, and that is more what helps us to bring it across in a cross-party parliament where we need to find alliances. Then it can also be a harm, as you already said, I would agree, that if you only see it from this angle, you also miss the point. Like, as I said, the money from Russia doesn't only flow from the Kremlin. The Defense of Democracy proposal of the Commission is talking only about registering those who are financed by member states, by third countries, like Russia. But if it's not Putin, if it's like his oligarch friend who gives the money, then it escapes this definition. So if you don't include in a mandatory register all organizations that receive funding from wherever source, then you miss the point, because you're probably missing the most dangerous ones that come under the radar with Gazprom, with state enterprises using their role, escaping such state definitions. So it also can be harmful. We need to still push for full transparency of all actors, because they will always be very creative to find the one thing that we like. The bigger the loophole, the more you can exploit it. So that I would just want to answer to that.
thanks very much for your comments as well. And since we don't want to miss any point, and we know that world is not only EU, will go a little bit beyond the EU, and I would like to include Nedim in the conversation. Nedim, what is your opinion, based on your experience and research, how Western Balkans and more specifically BHA respond to the strategic corruption?
Well, we respond with great enthusiasm to strategic corruption. And the reason for that is that the Western Balkans, with sitting forever on the verge of the EU, being completely open, having all the trade deals skewed in favor of the EU without receiving any structural and cohesion funds, having special agreements for brain migration and export to Germany primarily, but and especially in the healthcare sector, but also to other countries. Creates this, specific peripheral region on the verge of Europe where you have every single possible influence. You have strong EU influence. Much of the acquis is actually being used due to the fact that it's part of trade agreements with Europe, which cover many other areas. Then on the other hand, you have strong Russian influence through disinformation campaigns, through security threats, through coup attempts, through even terrorist actions in Kosovo. You have Turkish influence through presences. You have Hungary that has a secret agenda with some of parts of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So basically, you have US, of course, which provides security, but also never does anything to get rid of the structural reasons which foster insecurity. So you have really a broken mirror of international relations there. And then Western Balkans is a perfect space really to explore strategic corruption, because strategic corruption as a concept aims to explain how foreign interference through corrupt means translates into foreign influence. And so, in terms of, so for both contextual and theoretical reasons, it's a great place to think about strategic corruption and to explore strategic corruption. That said, I have to agree with some of the stuff that David has mentioned, because quite simply, if you keep reducing all politics and all foreign influence to corruption, you risk declaring everything corruption. You risk over-securitizing. In the last 10 years, corruption is not the only issue that's being securitized. Climate change has been securitized, economic trade. Many other things have also been declared a matter of national security. And that's not a bad thing, but we need to ask ourselves, has that really helped to solve any of these issues by itself? In the Western Balkans, it's a problem to securitize even some of these issues, reason being that quite simply some countries refuse to adapt their national security strategies in the way the US has done. So you have a special anti-corruption strategy that explicitly treats corruption as a national security issue. So that's one problem. The other problem is these indirect anti-corruption tools, which we don't, traditionally think about them that way, such as the foreign investment screening mechanisms. It's very difficult in the Western Balkans to get them adopted because the EU is not giving structural and cohesion funds. There is an inherent demand for funding and some countries have tried to borrow money from China under very unfavorable, in very unfavorable ways and under very bad conditions, Bosnia and Herzegovina and Montenegro in particular. Now, these deals are not likely to happen in the short run, reason being that currently there's a lot of political opposition. But that doesn't mean that the demand for funding is not there. The reason there is a demand for funding is quite simply that there's an ever-growing closer relationship with the EU without any of the structural and cohesion funds flowing into these countries. So it's a pretty one-sided trade-off. The enlargement doesn't look likely also in the short run without the internal reform of the EU, which will maybe not happen at all because many countries will be vetoed, so they won't be able to join the EU. So the reason why I'm talking so much about the EU, that's, to be clear, not engaged in strategic corruption there, is because its stronger engagement would undercut some of the structural deficiencies that create the environment which is so conducive to strategic corruption in the Western Balkans. Even if you would get these foreign investment screening mechanisms, and even if you would get the national security strategies that would model the one that we have in the US or the recent UK developments, which are perhaps more elaborate and better in that sense, we are not really sure if what kind of a meaningful contribution would that make. And also, as Ruslan Stefanov said to me recently, we are barely able to convince people to fight ordinary corruption. Will they be willing to fight now this corruption, which is more serious because it's strategic? So my idea is this. Actually, we stick with strategic corruption and we keep making policy papers and briefs about it, especially focused on the Western Balkans. I say this probably because I authored one. But also we acknowledge these risks that come, and we acknowledge that securitization might not solve issues. Mind you, in Romania and Georgia, I'm not sure about Moldova, Romania and Georgia, there was a securitization of corruption and anti-corruption measures some 15, 12 years ago. But the results have been mixed, have been strong, but mixed also, not a clear picture that it necessarily works. So my idea is this, securitization, not necessarily a panacea, but, you know, something that needs to be recognized that's bringing risks.
Yes, thank you very much. It's I really enjoyed this very open dialogue and comments. I do agree that we all agree that we have to tackle all these phenomena, like, you know, strategic corruption, state capture, illicit finance, and probably to explain it better, we also have to collect evidence about the link between them. Liz, you have been working on this. Would you please tell us more on how we collect evidence and what mechanisms are in place?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be brief, partly because it's really hard to collect evidence on this. So I would take two different sort of approaches, I guess. One thing is, I think it is really useful to try to track the mechanisms in individual cases, so quite deep contextual research. When I talk about mechanisms, I would sort of go through those three pillars, so the influence over formation of the rules and policy, the implementation, and then the disabling of the accountability institutions, and just track how those institutions get captured and different ways of doing it. I mean, a lot of it is through appointments, actually, and patronage power. In tracking it, I think what we need to look for is what's the influence over the process, what's the outcome of that, and there we're looking partly at who's the beneficiary. And then ideally, we would need to triangulate those and find that the beneficiary is the person who influenced or the group that influenced the process. It's really difficult to get that triangulation for these, but I think that should be the standard that we're aiming for. At the same time, on another stream, I would go for looking at much bigger macro indicators of state capture and illicit financial flows. This is, again, an area which we're just sort of, I think, on the very early stages of doing. But, for example, the Centre for the Study of Democracy has a good state capture assessment diagnostic tool. So I would recommend that. We have quite a lot of tools around looking at corruption risks in public procurement, some of which are around state capture. In terms of the illicit financial flows, I think that there is actually a lot of data that's collected. The problem is that it's not open and shared and public. So we need to do more around, obviously, the beneficial ownership transparency is helpful, but also trying to get access to bank data, SWIFT transaction data, systematizing the way we collect lists of politically exposed persons and the sharing of those lists. I think, there's a lot more that could be done here, but it is largely around making that data public, matching it up, and they're being able to pick apart the networks and trace the illicit financial flows.
Yes, thank you very much. And you have mentioned the work of Center for Study of Democracy, and I think most of us, I mean, it has been mentioned by the other colleagues as well, following the researches which are very useful and practical, which brings me back to my colleague from CSD, Daniela Mineva. Daniela, would you please share with us how do you see the possible break of the anti-corruption deadlock in the southeastern Europe, and what do you think is the future of anti-corruption strategies on EU, and not only on EU level, especially tackling strategic corruption? Is there a future?
Of course, thank you. I'll just need the clicker. If you can. Thank you. So I'll follow up on the discussion. And Nadim, thank you for explaining very well what's the situation in the Western Balkans. I'd just like to add a few details based on the analysis we have been performing in the Saudi anti-corruption initiative. So besides all these governance gaps that Nadim explained, let me just say that there was actually anti-corruption reform momentum around the year 2010, mostly due to EU enlargement perspectives, pressure from Brussels. However, after this momentum was lost, the window of opportunity has been also lost. For example, the countries missed to establish a really independent judiciary and prosecution. So it's now very difficult to change that. What solution can we find? Do we do vetting like in Albania and dismiss all the judges? It doesn't work because you cannot find new judges to replace them. Another opportunity missed is to interconnect all the public registers, property, taxes, revenues, land register, vehicle register, etc. Now we have development of artificial intelligence. We can use it to analyze big sets of data, but the data doesn't exist because it's not being gathered. All the asset declarations, if the asset declaration is written by hand on paper, it cannot be put into ChatGPT, right? So there are many opportunities missed, and we need to think how to jointly reinforce this process, especially now the enlargement has been kick-started by Ukraine. So there is hope that the countries will once again start their reforms. But we have seen from the past that the reforms they perform are mostly on paper. They're box-ticking reforms. They adopt new anti-corruption strategies. They set up new anti-corruption bodies. However, these strategies don't have any impact indicators. They're not being evaluated. They're not being enforced. The new bodies that have been set up or the new legislation passed, the process stops there. There is no enforcement. There is no capacity, for example, for financial investigations that have to be built during the last 10 years. And now when we have cryptocurrency, we cannot find experts in that area, especially in our region. So there is much to be done, and we need the support from other experts and other countries to build this capacity. So how deep is the problem with corruption in the Western Balkans? Let me just show you some of the data we have from the latest Saudi corruption monitoring system survey that we implement. You can see on the screen, these are the bribery rates we have. So just to clarify, this is experience-based victimization survey, not perception. And as you can see, on average, we have 21-25% bribery rates. Then on the next slide, we can see that almost all of the people who have been asked to give a bribe actually gave one. So the blue lines are the pressure exerted over the citizens, and the orange columns are the actual involvement. And we have involvement rates ranging from 40% in Albania to the lowest one is in Montenegro, 10%. And also very concerning trend is that in Albania, 80% of the people are willing to either offer a bribe or give a bribe if necessary. Again, this percent is lowest in Montenegro, 48%, but I would not say that this is a small number at all. And naturally, all this reflects in the trust in the government. Here on this chart, you see how the anti-corruption optimism has changed over the last decade. So these are the answer to the question, do you believe that your national government is capable of efficiently tackling corruption? And we have around 5% increase for over 10 years, but it's not something substantial we should be proud of. And here comes the big question, what to do about it. As you have probably noticed, I'm speaking and showing you results only of the small administrative corruption, but we have much bigger problems to discuss. And what we notice that we don't see a substantial return on investment of EU assistance. Just a number to make a point. In the IPA 2 support mechanisms from 2014 to 2020, there have been 690 million euro spent, specifically on rule of law advancement. However, our survey, the CMS, doesn't show any progress in decreasing the corruption levels, and we're speaking here about administrative corruption. You can imagine how much bigger is state capture. So obviously something should be changed, and what should be changed is exactly what the previous speakers mentioned. We should change the way we think. We should acknowledge that state capture exists. It's already in our government, in our system. And we should input this into the design of EU assistance so that we can foresee a sort of checking mechanism and risk assessment to prevent abuse and to seek how to achieve better impact with this money. And we can start, as I mentioned, with a better understanding of the state capture phenomenon. Here on the screen, you can see our state capture assessment diagnostics methodology. It has been already implemented in several countries. It produces several indexes, and it is based on both surveys among experts as well as hard data. The hard data includes mainly statistics on concentration, market concentration, so concentration of profits and turnover in specific groups of companies or a sector. And we have institutional enablers, we have environmental enablers, the media, administrative corruption, judiciary corruption, and several dimensions. One dimension is the business dimension. Here we have, for example, inefficiency of anti-monopoly laws, the lobbying laws, procurement, of course, and we have other dimensions such as, for example, the black market. Something else that we should think about and have in mind when designing policies or when giving away national money or EU assistance money is that this problem exists not only at the national level, but also at the local level. There are often cases when municipalities or counties where the mayor is aligned with the ruling political party, this municipality receives more funding from the budget, from foreign donors. They receive low-interest loans, debt annulment. They're selected for political appointments. And in turn, this municipality provides similar services and benefits to the local companies, quandus, gongus, and unfortunately sometimes even academia and media. And these entities in turn are forever grateful, of course, to the mayor or the municipality, and thus this municipality secures and mayor secures a re-election and receives some donation, and this cycle starts again. And last but not least, the big elephant in the room that we are discussing this whole week, basically, is the malign foreign influence that we have. It has multiple dimensions. So basically, Russia and China, as already mentioned, exert political, economic, and media pressure and influence in our country, and they are utilizing our cultural, language, and historical relations. So all of this should be taken into account. And what we can suggest is that there is some sort of algorithm for assessing the risk of capture during the provision of EU assistance. And when funding a company or organization or a project to do some sort of analysis if they have some privileged access to previous funding, if they're treated preferentially, if they receive very large public procurements, and if so, the assistance to be reevaluated and provided to such reform-minded individual or organization or ideas or projects that at the end of the day will have actual impact in terms of sentencing high-level corruption or improving the procedures in practice. So this is the main point I like to make, and I'm open to discuss further if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniela, and I'm sure, your, as it has been pointed out already, your research is very useful, and I would encourage the participants in not only the panel, but our guests also to go and check them out. I'm sure they would have many and good insights. So far, we have heard from our speakers how we could deal with the phenomenon of state capture and strategic corruption, illicit finance, from international EU perspective, also from the region. And I would like now to give the floor to Dr. Ramadan Elazi to share the Kosovo perspective on this issue. I could see he has been making notes, and I'm sure that he has lots of ideas to share. Dan, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Desislav. The way you put it is like the babushka. I think Kosovo is in Western Balkans, is in the wider Europe, so it's not isolated.
A case study.
Yeah, absolutely. As a case, it's not, I think, isolated in this discussion. But to me, I think the conversation on corruption is, since we are in the Euros, it's like with the goalkeepers. Everyone remembers the goals you missed, but no one seems to remember the ones you saved. And I think it's very important to talk about also how we can defend better our post. And this is part of the work we've been doing with the IRI Western Balkans Task Force on the threats to democracy with Nedim. I did the paper with a colleague on mapping the vulnerabilities in Kosovo towards malign foreign influence. And I think this discussion on concepts is very relevant. I think we use the word elite corruption, for instance, to denote some of those aspects that the strategic corruption seems to imply. What I will talk about is a bit of context, I think, what's creating this vulnerability, what we are trying to do in terms of countering or addressing it, and what are the challenges. So in terms of the context, what we have in Western Balkans is that you have a growing ethno-political radicalization and nationalism alongside, which is coupled or exacerbated by bilateral disputes stemming from the brutal wars we had in the 90s. And I think these two combine to create a ripe kind of moment for strategic corruption or for malign foreign influence. And because of these, I think our region has become a meeting point between the far right in the EU and Russia. And so what adds to this further context is that you have a very strong, as it was mentioned, Chinese and Russian presence. I mean, Russia has a military security base in our region that it calls it a humanitarian center. And you have China coming in with, in 2021, it was about $86 billion, and they call it loans, but there isn't loans. They call it investment, but there isn't Chinese investments. They're all loans. And this constituted about 40% of the total FDI for the region, so there is significant concern there. What we have tried to do, last year we had the Civil Society Forum as part of the Berlin Process Summit in Tirana. And this year it will be in Berlin because this initiative will celebrate its 10th anniversary. It came out as an answer, or a German answer, to the, I think, catastrophic statement at the time in 2014 of the President of the European Commission, who said there won't be enlargement in the next 5 years. While everyone knew no one was going to join EU anytime soon, saying that out loud kind of like had a significant negative impact in our region, in this kind of confidence in the transformative power of the European integration process. But anyways, what we discuss here is some of the things that also Nedi mentioned, is looking at the FDI screening and how we can bring Western Balkans to share information on screening different companies and investments. Because if just one country is doing it and it's not sharing with the rest, it's just it's not very effective. And here we talk about the 2019 EU regulation, or the FDI regulation, and how we are going to improve the kind of standards in our region to be further aligned or transpose some of the standards from this regulation. And this year we're going to do an assessment where each country of the region stands in relation to this regulation. What Christian mentioned is actually some of the things, some of the countries in the region are ahead. For instance, in Kosovo we had digitized declaration of assets and wealth for quite a number of years, and we have the director of anti-corruption agency present here, who perhaps can talk more if there will be interest on that. Also, this kind of regulations on the amount limit, financial limits of you can limits to financial transactions in cash, and anything, for instance, in case of Kosovo that's above, I think, 10,000 euros, it's immediately flagged to the security institutions, and they're going to do a background check on that to see where that money is coming from. Problem is there isn't a lot of cooperation also between Western Balkans and EU member states. For instance, in Albania, the biggest FDIs are coming from Netherlands, and we know that there's a lot of behind the scene there. But you need that kind of cooperation with Netherlands in order to go through the process. So the conversation we are having here is about the corruption in Western Balkans. It's an important conversation, but we never, well, not never, sorry, but we need to have a greater conversation or a deeper conversation about the nexus between corruption in Western Balkans and in EU member state companies or countries, and how these two kind of like inform each other or help out each other. Other aspect we try to do is on beneficial owners register. For instance, Kosovo now is in the process of adopting a law on register of beneficial owners. What we find there as some kind of lesson learned is, for instance, they included civil society organizations, which is a concern because that could be abused also to potentially silence critical organizations. But they removed faith-based organizations from the law, and we think this is a problem. Faith-based organizations are a major conduit or interlocutor in the malign foreign influence and what you are calling strategic corruption. The other things we talk about is finances of political parties. key problem there is capacities of institutions to monitor effectively, just as a know-how, not just in terms of the personnel, but a know-how in tracking, monitoring digital finances and digital investments. And this is about also platform accountability. So talking about different platforms and how they would be more accountable to the national legislation and to the national institutions in addressing the digital finances. And let me conclude with challenges. I think key challenge for Western Balkans, and again, trickles down to Kosovo, is that you have a lack of EU cohesion in terms of who is a malign actor. There is pretty much consensus on Russia, but when it comes to China, I don't think you have a lot of cohesion within EU to kind of qualify China as a malign, unfortunately, a malign foreign actor. And this is a problem. EU needs to come together with a stronger, more cohesive policy on dealing with China. And because China is using this lack of EU cohesiveness on this aspect in further exacerbating its influence. We look at Huawei, who has signed, for instance, contracts for access to state data centers in that aspect. There's education programs that Huawei is investing on to bring people from the region to China. And those are a concern from the normative aspect, because we are not so sure about the kind of system of values that these individuals would bring back to the region if they're involved in the state institutions. And in conclusion, I think what our region shows in terms of challenges is that geopolitical interests always trump normative commitments. When you look at the data and the situation, countries that are doing better in rule of law and democratic performance are not necessarily those who are further down the path in European accession process. Geopolitical considerations are major, and for instance, countries lacking alignment with EU's common foreign security policy are getting away with it because of these kind of geopolitical considerations. And so there should be, I think, a better in a way, symmetrical conversation in terms of strategic corruption, where there is a more sharing of the burden in getting this effectively countered. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting. I mean, actually, we are doing really well with time. I'm quite impressed, and we still have time. And I would like to ask all of you if you could conclude and answer to a question that I didn't ask you, but you would like to make a comment. And also representing an international intergovernmental regional organization, I would like just to hear your comments, like what do you think we could do better as an international community to address these issues? And I would start with Mr. Becker being our first speaker. If you could say a few words.
I think all the tools have been mentioned, and I fully agree that building up these registers, building up the transparency of the several steps where you need to see who owns things, how are they flowing, how do they approach the political sphere, like from the asset and real estate registers to the lobby registers, the question of how money flows to political actors, party financing, side income of politicians, all this. I think this is the central tools, and there we need to be just so much better in having these data as digital, as available. You said like paper is the enemy and paper is existing. Like I remember how like Germans sent people in the financial crisis to Greece to tell how to build a digital tax administration, and at the same time the tax administration in Berlin, the city-state of Berlin, was mostly working on paper. So like we have a lot of contradictions there and a lot of weak spots, and that is very much on in all the regions of Europe, and I think this working together is total key. There is also a lot of room for more investment to like replace the foreign malign actors with actual alternatives, because if you want to build a bridge and China is the only country that gives you money, I do see how Montenegro ended up that line, as dangerous as it was. There is the lack of the EU funds. There is now this idea of this alternative money, but it's still not as out there as we as EU countries would have very much the financial possibilities, if also very much a German finance minister would perhaps climb down from the ideas that every debt is bad as soon as it's public, while it's totally good if it's private. And I think there's also a lot of more potential of being strong in offering democratic alternatives, European alternatives to the malign foreign actors. There is 14 billion of pre-accession assistance already. So you said twice that there's no EU cohesion funds. That's true, but they have a different name. There's 14 billion, but I think 14 billion for the room of 2021 to 2027 pre-accession assistance is 14 billion. But like that's not the potential of investments to replace with EU money, build like a renewable infrastructure in Western Balkan countries and many countries that would make us more independent of not only the money, also the oil, the gas of like dictatorships. So I think that would be key elements.
Thank you. Oksana, what's your thoughts and observations?
I really love your phrase about the goalkeepers who are not get rewarded for keeping the goal. And OECD has public integrity indicators that are based on the comprehensive recommendation, how do we define actually the integrity framework. And within of these indicators, the countries, they are reporting which elements of the integrity system they have in place. And through this exercise, you can see the countries that, for example, have good lobbying regulations and practices. So many countries don't have them, but there are, for example, 2 of them even that regulate that when lobbyists are coming into government, this revolving door principle, there is also the regulation like how to proceed and how to manage this conflict of interest risk. So I would just like to invite you to have a look at those countries that are doing well and to get inspiration how to improve the integrity frameworks, to make the loopholes smaller.
Thank you. Liz?
This is a geopolitical issue. We've been talking about how strategic corruption is a geopolitical issue. It's not enough just to have technical solutions. We've got to have geopolitical solutions, I think. And I think, I know that Daniel Freund's been doing great work, and it's great to have Christian here. But it's actually really depressing to hear that you think that the strongest tool is conditionality. Because conditionality has absolutely failed, and the EU has not been consistent and even-handed in how it's used conditionality. It took the EU a really long time to call out Orban. And still, as you say, he gets away with fake compliance. So I think, we do need actually proper political solutions here. And the EU needs to start being more even-handed, more consistent in how it uses conditionality, both the positive and the negative. And maybe then we could start to see some progress.
Well, that was a strong message. Nadim?
So nothing much to add here at the end. Really just anti-corruption is a tough thing, expensive. Corruption is often a national security threat, and it might, for those reasons, cost us much to actually confront it. But it's a battle worth having. And being aware of the risks the battle carries is also very useful, I think.
Nadim, corruption is also very expensive. I'm not sure whether anti-corruption is more expensive than corruption. I could argue here. But Daniela, what's your thoughts?
I'll comment on both how to tackle strategic corruption and state capture if I can, because there are a lot of tools already mentioned how to tackle strategic corruption. It's obvious it's recognized as a threat because it comes from external forces. We can always blame Russia and China, and we develop these tools how to tackle this. But the problem is also how to deal with state capture, because nobody wants to admit that state capture existed. We cannot find it in anti-corruption strategies, official documents as a term, and we're closing our eyes also for this problem, which actually allows the penetration of foreign influence. So in terms of state capture, these are great tools. You already mentioned use of big data for risk analysis, for investment screening. We can do all that, but we can also focus not only on this technical solution, but to focus on prevention, and prevention starts from changing the behavior. So maybe a good place to invest is also on anti-corruption education and changing the culture to be more resilient. And also, why not have a special course in the University of Financial Investigators, how to be a financial investigator and how to tackle money laundering.
Thank you, Daniela. Very practical suggestions. But yeah, I agree. And here we are discussing about strategic corruption. So now it's getting in focus and in light. David.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, what I take from this discussion, following on, I think, from what Liz said, is what exactly is the EU doing in this region? Christian described the EU as Putin's perfect structure. Nadim has said strategic corruption is being encouraged by omissions in the EU approach around structural cohesion funds. And Ramadan has said, you know, the EU doesn't reward those who make progress on anti-corruption. It's all about geopolitics. This flips the narrative about the role of the EU on its head. The EU is not necessarily a good governance actor. So what kind of actor is it? Is there anyone from the EU here? And maybe that's also telling. So who's going to change the approach? How, when, and under what conditions?
Thank you. Dan?
Yeah, I think this is a battle of concepts again. Our region produced very important one. I think it was Montenegro who came up with the so-called stabilitocracy. So I think this is where the conversation about geopolitical goals trumping normative commitments comes in. But we also, this criticism about the approach shouldn't be interpreted in any way as skepticism. I think our region would have been, way worse without this kind of engagement. But I think it is important for the European Union to recognize, the ways through which it can further capitalize the process as a transformative process. And what the problem is this crisis of credibility, as we talked about. Again, you have something preaching European Commission. I think they try a lot, and they try to do the best. Now with the growth plan that Christian hinted, this is going to be an important mechanism because it provides a clear idea of what country needs to do in order to get further in the process. We also are talking about potential reforms. Our region came up with this staged accession model. The term stage kind of sounds bad because it won't be staged, but the point is there needs to be clarity about how reforms are rewarded and help you move in the next level. But about the credibility, we discussed this. For instance, it is funny, not only on China, it is a Chinese company in Croatia, EU member state, who won a public tender to build the bridge, one of the largest bridges, 500 million euros. They use the framework, the legal framework now. I mean, there hasn't been any investigation as far as I know if it was a case of other kind of like means through which they got a contract. But even in 2014 in Serbia, it was the same situation. EU built the bridge with EU money. So EU should be more, I think, also vigilant of these kind of situation and the kind of message it's sending. In Serbia, we also have French and Chinese companies working together on building a metroway. So, you know, at one point we hear these normative speeches about what China is, what the capital of, about corrosive capital in Russia. And on the other hand, you have some other mixed messages. So I think what I'm trying to say is that we need clarity of messages. And I will conclude with this. I think it's important also to be, again, going back to my suggestion, we need a better conversation on both ways, a more symmetrical conversation on strategic corruption, and also avoid the kind of data that would create a bit of a wrong perception. For instance, a large chunk of the money that went to rule of law in the region was actually EULEX, the European Rule of Law Mission in Kosovo. You know, and EULEX had executive mandate. Judges and prosecutors from EULEX had the power to prosecute and investigate anybody they thought was corrupted. And EU's Court of Auditors report kind of like talks about why that wasn't effective and that it didn't work. Because sometimes I think we need to be also careful about the kind of perceptions we are creating about the problem. Because the EULEX was designed under the perception that corruption is widespread, it's everywhere. And they come in and they realize, no, that wasn't part perhaps of that much of the reality. You know, there's more challenges in fighting the kind of corruption that's more strategic, as we are saying. It has to do with corrosive capital and so forth. And then you haven't designed the proper mechanisms to intervene on that. So we need to have this conversation both ways. And again, not see the region as what maybe Nadim said in the margins. You know, it's important to have this mental picture. Western Balkans is surrounded by EU member states. It's not in the periphery of EU member states, you know, Greece, Bulgaria. I mean, we are surrounded. And so we are not talking about bringing a neighborhood in the EU. We are talking about closing kind of like the loophole that is right now in the EU member state. And it is difficult for this region that has been promised this future since 2003 to be kept at the waiting room by EU member states.
Thanks a lot. I mean, I agree with you that more conversation and more dialogue obviously is needed. I mean, I didn't expect we'll go into EU accession discussion, but I think that based on our discussion today, we can conclude that the more conversation and more research on the topic of strategic corruption, state capture, and illicit finance is needed. What is more needed is translating the concepts into practical actions and find strategies, finding a way to prevent and address this issue. We are, I mean, now really exceeding the time. That's why I would like to thank all our panelists for this very, I really enjoyed our discussions. I hope that you also enjoyed it. And I would like also to thank all of you for being here today with us and to wish you a very nice evening and celebrate the I cannot say this word, solstice today. Thank you very much.